Okay, welcome to the lecture on science foundations. So this is the important lecture in the lecture series that's about research, it's about research methods, it's about all of the important stuff that underpins a lot of what we look at in positive psychology. So when we look at interventions, when we look at well-being, when we look at practices that promote different aspects of well-being and mental health and so on, how do we know that they're effective? How do we know that they're going to have an effect on a population? How do we know who they're going to be effective for and for how long, and so on? Well, all of that is within this lecture, which is very important. And it's sort of one of those very important ones that can be a little bit dry for some people, but it's one of the most important topics that we have in positive psychology, because without this, we don't have a field called positive psychology. So I'm going to do my best to make this as engaging as possible. I'm going to use videos to explain various concepts, videos that I find engaging and very helpful in explaining very important concepts and phenomena and statistical methods and so on. You don't have to be an expert in statistics to understand any of this. You don't have to want to understand statistics. We're not going to go into any really much detail about statistics, but it's just mainly talking about the types of research methods that we get in positive psychology and the inferences that we can draw from them. This will be important for your first assignment that we look at, which will be on positive psychology, how the field came about, but also you'll be asked to analyze some research studies in the field of positive psychology. And the topics that we cover in this lecture will be very important for you to be able to speak to those things we want you to comment on in the assignment, such as what are the biases or potential factors that might influence the results that were obtained? What are the types of inferences that we can draw from the studies that you analyze within your assignment? What are the limitations of the studies, and what does future research need to focus on to try and help remedy some of those limitations? So those are some of the things that we're going to cover today. So it will be really important for your first assignment, and it'll also be important for your second assignment, and also it'll be important for various parts of the course and to help understand all the topics that we cover. So what are we going to go through? Well, we're going to first look at the paradigm shift. So I referred to the paradigm shift in the very first lecture, and how the field of psychology and some of the social sciences and even broader than that are going through a paradigm shift where they're starting to focus on factors that promote well-being and the positive aspects of mental health, and not just helping relieve mental illness and so on. But really the method that is used in psychology generally is borrowed and used in positive psychology. So it's not a difference in any method. Different types of psychology have different nuances when it comes to picking different research methods, but really the research methods that we get in positive psychology are used in all other parts of psychology as well. So there are no differences there, but it is a shift in focus. So we're using these same methods to look at different topics, ones that are more focused on well-being and the positive aspects of mental health and helping people flourish and so on. We're going to look at the scientific method. So what is the scientific method? What are the uses of the scientific method? We're going to talk about why the scientific method is necessary, go through various cognitive biases and so on. I'll give some examples of that. I'll talk about some biases in the research literature that have potentially impacted entire research literatures, that will really impact the conclusions that we can draw from the literatures. If an entire research literature is biased, then it's problematic for people trying to make recommendations or use that information to apply in practice or whatever it might be. To discuss the research method topics, we're going to look at study design. So what are the different types of study design? I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on that. That'll be probably the time I spend most on looking at the different types of study design, and that's because it's very important for your first assignment, and these are the types of things you might comment on when you look at your first assignment. The different types of measures that you get in different types of studies, so you get self-report measures, you get informant report measures and so on. You get more objective type measures such as measures of cortisol, which is contained within the saliva, which you can draw conclusions from and so on. Different types of measures and their different purposes and so on. Different samples that you might, and the limitations with the various types of methods. So we'll touch on all of these, but we won't go into a huge amount of detail in all of the topics because we just don't have enough time. And then towards the very end, we'll use some sample studies that are very well known in the positive psychology literature, and we'll apply some of the concepts that we've learned in the lecture to that. And it's kind of a similar thing that you might want to do for your first assignment. Of course, you'll be using different articles, but the techniques and the things that we comment on in this lecture might be parallel to the types of things that you draw on in your assignment. Okay, so to start with, we're going to understand the paradigm shift as a shift in focus, but not in method. So what do I mean when I say that? So I went through this. This is known as the mental health continuum, or the spectrum of mental health. We went through this in the very first lecture, so I'll just briefly recap here so I can explain. We went through mental health. Mental health exists on a continuum from -5, which represents suffering or absolute suffering down the very bottom, to +5, which is represents flourishing, or the presence of positive mental health, so a sense of optimism for the future and so on. Much of psychology is focused on managing the adverse states, or the unpleasant states, and the potentially harmful states that we get down the bottom of the spectrum. So things such as depression, the experience of depression, anxiety, different types of mental illness that exist down this bottom end of the scale here. That side of the spectrum is mainly focused on helping people who are suffering, so relieving mental illness, relieving feelings of depression and unpleasant emotions and so on. Whereas the field of positive psychology is about also promoting positive mental states. It's not about ignoring what's going on down the left here, but it's about also promoting what might be above this 0 point. So this 0 point, if -5 represents absolute suffering and +5 represents the presence of flourishing, then 0 represents the absence of mental illness. But it doesn't necessarily mean that we have the presence of positive flourishing and well-being and so on. So what might exist up there? Well, maybe we have a sense of hope for the future. We feel optimistic about the future. We feel that good things are going to happen to us, and we feel overall a positive sense of feeling that draws us to the future. A sense of empathy, courage, gratitude, and so on, are other types of emotions and experiences you might expect to attain up the top of the mental health continuum. So a lot of positive psychology is focused on introducing these enablers, so things or interventions or activities or practices or programs, when we're talking about large groups of people, that might help people move up this mental health continuum. So not only relieve mental illness and suffering, but also promote the presence of positive mental health or flourishing. So we might have a hope intervention that helps implement a sense of hope about the future. Or we might have an intervention that builds a sense of optimism, and so on. So there's a range of different interventions that can promote different types of affective states or feelings in people, and the positive psychology ones are obviously focused on trying to help people attain that sense of flourishing, so the more positive characteristics. So the field of positive psychology is more concerned with helping people move up beyond that 0 point, so it's not ignoring what's on the left, but helping people move up towards that state of flourishing. Whereas a lot of psychology, according to a lot of the scholars and a lot of the data that they state, which I'll show you in a minute, suggests that a lot of psychology as a whole, particularly the more clinical areas, understandably, have focused on relieving people or healing people who are suffering. So it's more just a shift in focus, and that we're more going to be focusing on the positive states rather than just looking at the harmful possible experiences that we might have. Okay. Positive psychology, if we're going to talk about the differences in positive psychology, it's more solution focused, it's more approach focused, it's more an approach that focuses on building positive qualities in people, so things that they hold already, and trying to bring those out into the light, whereas the more traditional areas of psychology, potentially clinical psychology, is more focused on when things go wrong. So we heal people by helping them manage maladaptive behaviors, or maybe they have maladaptive thinking patterns that might be creating states of anxiety or depression and so on, and it's about giving them tools to help overcome those obstacles. So positive psychology is a little bit different in that we primarily focus on strengths and building these positive qualities in people. So why is all this needed? I'm going to show you a video of Tal Ben-Shahar. He is well known in the field of positive psychology. He's a well-known teacher of positive psychology. He worked at Harvard teaching an online course in positive psychology, which became very popular, and he's one of the very well-known and popular teachers at Harvard University. So I'm just going to show you a video of him doing a presentation on the ratio of positive to negative in the study of psychology as a whole.
As part of social psychology or clinical psychology, why have so many scholars around the world united around this concept of a positive psychology? So this is what I want to do today. In the year 2000, research was done by David Myers. David Myers from Hope College. Some of you who have studied social psychology may have read his textbook. Did research looking at psychological abstracts. And what he looked at was the ratio between quote-unquote negative research and quote-unquote positive research. And here is what he found. From 1967 to the year 2000, this was around the time when positive psychology started. What he found in the 33 years are over 5,000 articles on anger. 5,000 research articles on anger. He found over 41,000 research articles on anxiety. And over 50,000 articles on depression. And then he looked at positive words, positive research. He looked for research on joy, and he found a staggering 415 studies. It does get better. He looked at research on happiness, and he found close to 2,000 articles on happiness in 33 years. Life satisfaction came out top, over 2,500 studies. Still, if you look at that, the negative studies versus the positive studies, the ratio that you get is 21 to 1. For every one article on some positive aspect, some positive element of life, well-being, satisfaction, joy, happiness, you get 21 articles on depression, anxiety, schizophrenia, neurosis, and so on. Ratio of 21 to 1. Very depressing ratio, I must admit. In fact, it makes me very angry and anxious.
Okay, so you just heard a little bit about some of the statistics. We went through some of those in the very first lecture where we talked about the emphasis on of psychology on the more the healing emphasis that it had in those early days up until around the time of the positive psychology movement, which was in the late 90s. So things are starting to shift now, but it's more a shift in focus and not in method. And that's what's encapsulated by this quote. So this is a quote by Peterson. I keep saying it, but that's essentially what captures the paradigm shift in positive psychology. So it's got nothing to do with method, but it's just the content that we're studying. We're using the same tools to look at different phenomena. So the field of positive psychology is built on a few important assumptions, and these are some of them that Chris Peterson, one of the founders of the field of positive psychology, notes in his book that he published in 2006. And the first one is, what is good about life is as genuine as what is bad, therefore deserves equal attention from psychologists. So up until around the time of the positive psychology movement, there was a lot of skepticism. People were very cynical about studying things such as happiness and experiences such as joy and satisfaction and engagement and well-being and so on. They thought they were a little bit fluffy. They were often seen as fluffy and intangible, and therefore there was a lot of skepticism and cynicism about these concepts. However, when you think about it, they are very important psychological states that we have. We all have experiences of joy. We all have experiences of excitement from time to time. We all have experiences of pleasant feelings and positive emotions and happiness and life satisfaction and so on. Some people more than others, but they are genuine experiences that people have. So the second quote here, the most basic assumption is that human goodness and excellence are as authentic as disease, disorder, and distress. So it's about saying that, these feelings, despite the fact that they've been viewed with a lot of skepticism and cynicism throughout a lot of the history of psychology, they are very authentic and real experiences that people have, and therefore they deserve scientific inquiry. Potentially they could offer us a very new path towards enabling well-being. So those are some important assumptions, that positive feelings, positive states, flourishing, well-being, happiness, and so on are authentic, they're real, and they deserve scientific attention and inquiry. Now, isn't the positive covered already? So when you go to a bookstore, you might go to the Readings bookstore in Carlton, or any other bookstore around Melbourne or Amazon or wherever, you can find a whole host of different self-help books where these types of things are covered. So how to get the most out of yourself at work, how to live a productive life, how do you achieve happiness, and so on. Some of these books, I must say, are written by positive psychology scholars. And in that case, the conclusions are drawn from the research, not entirely the same, but a lot of the time these books are just sort of self-help books written by people's own personal experiences and so on. So is it covered already? How does positive psychology differ from what's called pop psychology? Well, the difference essentially is that positive psychology, the conclusions from positive psychology are drawn from scientific methods or empirical methods, tested, a lot of the time quantitative methods where statistics and various controls are applied in the research setting to try and get bias-free answers to different questions that we might have, whereas these sorts of things are not done a lot of the time in just a typical self-help book. So with positive psychology, because it is based on the scientific method, it is about discovering and testing whether a prediction that we make based on the research literature or a theory or whatever it might be is real, but it's not to confirm our own intuition. So we have to be, when we apply the scientific method, we have to have hypotheses that are falsifiable. We have to be willing to reject an idea or a prediction that we make, because that's how science works. When we only look for information that backs up what we've already concluded, then it ceases to become scientific in that case. So pop psychology, you often see these books in the bookstores. They're written by various people, business leaders, politicians, people who have gone through various experiences. They're often based on their own life experiences. Sometimes these books have real pearls of wisdom in them. The difference, however, is that it's untested. So while the information they have might work for some people, they might be recommended something that's untested or that can potentially lead to harm if it isn't tested and it isn't assessed in a scientific manner. So therefore, the conclusions in these books are often oversimplifications. Conclusions based on real life experiences are often misinterpreted, where as humans we're prone to a whole range of different psychological biases that can affect our judgment and decision making. And because of that, we often draw incorrect conclusions about different experiences that we have. So that's the difference between positive psychology and pop psychology. Positive psychology is based on the scientific method and uses empirical data to test scientific hypotheses and so on. Okay, so now that we've gone through positive psychology, it's a shift in focus, not in method, and we've talked about how positive psychology came about and how it differs from pop psychology in that it's focused on empirical, testable predictions. Let's look at some uses of the scientific method and just look at what is the scientific method and how is it applied in positive psychology. So to do this, I'm just going to show you a range of images. I want you to think about the first thing that comes to mind when you see these images, and just keep that in mind. And then I'll talk about the relevance of these images after. So here's a picture of a man's face. What do you see when you see this face? Which way is he looking? Is he looking straight towards you, or is he looking towards the right-hand side of the screen? What do you see in this image? Is it a picture of rocks and trees covered in snow? Looks like the side of a cliff there, or a ski slope, or whatever it might be. Or do you see a face in the mountain there, where you've got the eye, a little ridge for the nose, same for the mouth, and so on. Okay, here, which is darker, A or B? So I want you to take a look at this and just decide for yourself, which one do you think is darker, A or B? So most people, when they look at this, think or feel that A is darker than B. However, this is a well-known cognitive illusion. They're actually the same color. That might not be immediately obvious to you, and it doesn't matter how many times we look at this, A always generally appears darker than B. It only becomes obvious when you block that middle part of the figure there, and then you'll see the actual real color emerge. So when I put this there, you can all of a sudden notice that A and B are essentially the same color, and there's really no difference between them. When you take that away, they look different again. So it's really our brain playing a trick on us when we think that they're different. They're actually the same color. Now, if you do think that this is a trick and that this is some sort of a trick that I've built into this video, you can easily just put your finger in the middle of A and B there and block the middle part of it, and you'll see the same thing happen. So A and B are the same color. It doesn't matter what goes in the middle. As long as that middle part is blocked, they are perceived as being the same color. Okay, which tower is leaning more, left or right? So have a think about it. Which one is leaning more? Which one you feel is leaning more? Well, the answer is they're both the exact same image side by side, whereas most people feel that the tower on the right-hand side is actually leaning more than the tower on the left-hand side. And it's essentially because people compare different parts of the image. So they should be comparing that blue sky space on the left-hand side of the right-hand tower with the same part of the image on the left-hand side. However, what they tend to do is compare it with the right-hand side of figure 1. You can see that the gap is smaller there, which means we feel that the tower on the right-hand side is actually leaning more than what it actually is. In actuality, they're both leaning the same amounts, the exact same image side by side. And you can only tell when you put a ruler up, and you can see that it's the same distance from the left and the right when you do it. Here's an image. This is a funny one. So we've got an upside down photo of Donald Trump. They've made these for all the famous leaders in the world. They started with Margaret Thatcher back in the 1980s. Which I believe was done actually in a psychological study. Tony Abbott has been done. There's been a very famous one was of Barack Obama, which has been spoken about, and this is the most recent one, obviously, because Donald Trump is the current US president. So we've got two images side by side. They're obviously upside down. I want you to just have a look at them and just have a think about which image looks a bit funny to you. Is it the image that's on the left, or is it the image that's on the right? So most people feel that the image on the right-hand side, as it is now, looks a little bit funny. They're not really sure why, but it just doesn't quite look right. Now, I'm going to flip these images upside down so that the image that's currently on the right-hand side will go upright, and it'll appear on the left-hand side, and the image that's on the left-hand side currently will be flipped and it'll go upright onto the right-hand side. And it's only when I do that that you notice how strange that image did appear. So what they've done in this photo is essentially the mouth and the eyes of the photo have been snipped out of the photo and then pasted upside down onto the image. When the image is upright, you can see how silly it looks and how bizarre it looks. However, when the image is upside down, it's very difficult to determine why it doesn't look that way anymore. In fact, it's hard to tell the difference a lot of the time between the correct image and the one that's had this manipulation done to it. So why does all these things happen? Well, essentially, the brain is a pattern detecting engine. So we often see patterns in real life phenomena. It's helped us survive throughout the ages. You know, if we pick an apple from a tree or whatever it might be, and it turns out to be something that made us sick, well, potentially, if we have this survival mechanism built into us, then we might have this feeling that we don't want to eat those apples anymore because they might lead us to become sick into the future. So it's a survival mechanism that's been built in us through evolution and natural selection. However, this pattern detection, often it results in different types of psychological biases, it results in different shortcuts and so on, which can result in incorrect decision-making, incorrect conclusions drawn from real-life experiences and so on. And this is a well-known phenomenon. So we have a range of different psychological biases. I have a number on the screen at the moment. This is not an exhaustive list, but it's just a number that I feel are important, potentially because they can lead us to make bad decisions in real life, or they can lead us to make incorrect conclusions from real life experiences, or they can bias research. And this is why it's important to have something like the scientific method, because it helps us override our natural psychological biases that we have. The scientific method is built with that purpose. So what are the different types of psychological biases and how do they affect human judgment? So the first one that I've got here is loss aversion, which is essentially people's tendency to prefer avoiding losses to acquiring equivalent gain. So this comes from the negativity bias, which we went through in the first lecture, because bad, as a general rule of thumb, is stronger than good. Losing hurts more than it feels good to win that same amount. So if you think about $50, generally hurts more to lose $50 than it feels good to win $50. In fact, a lot of the research that goes into this suggests that it hurts more by a factor of about 2 to 1. So it's double the pain for the equivalent gain that you potentially get. So that's a loss aversion. Now, when you think about it, $50, whether you win $50 or lose $50, it's the exact same amount of money, so it shouldn't really matter. However, it does matter because our psychological system is built in a way that makes it matter. And it's built in that way because potentially it helped us survive, throughout the ages. But that can affect the way we respond to different things in real life and lead us to make silly decisions or potentially irrational decisions that might not matter for us. So that's one that's going to impact us in real life. The gambler's fallacy, which is the second one here, is another one. Some of you might be familiar with this. If you've ever studied first-year psychology, you would have come across a lot of these, but essentially the gambler's fallacy is a mistaken belief that if something happens more frequently than is normal or typical, it'll happen less likely in the future because we expect things, if there's about a 50% chance of it happening, to equal out in the long run. So for example, if we're flipping a coin, we're going to flip the coin 6 times and we flip it 5 times out of 6, and all those times you've got heads instead of tails. And then you ask someone what's the probability that the 6th toss is going to be a head or a tails. People might be more inclined to say, well, we've already had 6 heads. There's a 50% chance that it will become up as head or tail. Therefore, the next one's probably more likely to be a tail because we haven't had one of those yet. In actuality, they're all completely independent events. The outcomes of previous coin tosses have absolutely nothing to do with future ones. However, we think that they do. Doesn't matter what's happened before it. Even if we had 100 heads come up in a row, the next one, whether it's a head or a tail, is still 50%. It doesn't matter what's come before it. Groupthink is another one. Another psychological bias, which is our desire to pursue harmony or conformity within the group, and it often results in irrational, dysfunctional decision-making outcome. A lot of the time, this is not a conscious phenomenon, so we might unconsciously just go along with the group because that's what feels good to do, and we don't really know that's what's happening, but that is what's happening. This can also be a completely conscious thing where we make the wrong choice on purpose, simply to fit in. There were some famous studies that were done in the 1950s by Solomon Asch, where he got people into a room, and if you've studied first-year psychology, you would know about this as well, where essentially he put 2 lines on a screen in front of a group of people and asked people to say, which line is longer or shorter than the other one. There was one real participant in the room and a lot of Confederates who were just working for the experimenter. When he instructed the Confederates just to give the wrong answer, as in the shorter line, they perceived the shorter line, the real shorter line, to be longer than the on the screen. A lot of the time, the Confederate or the real participant went on and actually gave the same wrong answer, despite the fact that it was clearly the wrong answer. So that's what we know as the conformity. Groupthink, it can be conscious or unconscious. Halo effect, where we see one positive or negative trait in someone, we tend to think a lot of the other parts of that person are positive or negative depending on what that first characteristic we notice is. So if someone's physically attractive, potentially we think they're smarter, we think they've got a better personality, and so on. That's a common one that people have. If someone's wearing glasses, we often have the feeling that they're smarter than people who don't wear glasses, and so on. The availability heuristic, I referred to this in the first lecture. It's essentially a mental shortcut that relies on immediate examples of events that come to mind when evaluating a specific topic or a concept or method, or how likely something is to happen. So if we think, how likely is terrorism likely to be today? Well, if it's been reported a lot in the news recently, you're more likely to say that it's much more likely because you can retrieve examples more easily to mind. Because the news is focused a lot of the time on negative events, this is a very common one. So when we watch all the different news programs, we're more likely to think that the world is this horrible, violent, ugly place, despite the fact that the research shows the complete opposite. The world is actually becoming safer, it's becoming better, it's becoming less violent, and wars are becoming less horrible, and so on. But you wouldn't get that feeling from watching the news because it's all focused mainly on negative information, because people who run news agencies knows that's what makes people watch it. But it results in this availability heuristic. People think the world is a horrible place when in actuality, most of the time it isn't. The bandwagon effect is the probability of an individual endorsing an idea based on how many other people have endorsed the idea. That one's essentially self-explanatory, but it's very important because it can affect psychological research. If people are drawing a particular conclusion Even if they're saying things like, well, you're an idiot if you don't believe this, it can still be a very important mistake to believe it. Just because a lot of people believe something doesn't tell you anything about whether it's true, and that's what the scientific method helps us explain. And the last one I've got here is the confirmation bias, which is potentially one of the most powerful psychological biases that we have, because it affects all of us. It affects the most seasoned researchers as much as it affects lay people as well. And it's essentially the tendency to search for or interpret or favor or recall information in a way that confirms one's pre-existing beliefs or hypotheses. And anything that contradicts your belief or hypotheses, you essentially dismiss or look for problems in that, whereas you don't apply the same critical lens to something that confirms what you think. For example, if I'm a man and I think men are smarter than women and I have the confirmation bias about that, well, I'll only look for information that confirms that bias. And anything that shows that women have higher IQs than men or whatever it might be, I'll look for problems in that research, look for anything that might help me confirm my pre-existing belief. And that's known as the confirmation bias. There are many other examples of psychological biases as well. I'm going to show you a video in a little bit that will talk about some others and potentially some of these ones too. But they're very important because the scientific method and what we do in science helps us overcome a lot of these biases that result in incorrect decisions and incorrect judgments about real-world phenomena. So, positive psychology. This is a definition of positive psychology from Chris Peterson. It is the scientific study of what goes right in life from birth to death and at all stops in between. So what are the positive things that we could study in life? Strengths of character, ethics, positive emotions, positive feelings, work engagement, and so on. These things that tended to get less attention in the history of research are coming out into light through positive psychology and using the scientific method. So what does a scientific study refer to? The scientific method, and this just comes from the Oxford Dictionary because it's a really nice way to explain it. It is a method that has essentially characterized natural science since the 17th century, and it consists of systematic observation, measurement, and experiment, and the formulation and testing and modification of hypotheses based on the research literature, or what you would reliably predict to be the outcome of the study based on the information that is available. Usually that's existing theory or existing research studies that existed up until that point in time. So it's a systematic